Is there a way to reconcile transgenderism with Catholicism? There are several points of well-established doctrine that pertain to this that we can first look at. 1. All people are made male or female. 2. The body and the sexual identity are gifts from God that must be accepted. 3. Mutilation, except for grave necessity, is not permitted by divine law. For the first point, the Church teaches that all people are made in the image of God as either male or female. There are no exceptions to this. Even though there may be people who identify as something other than male or female, ultimately, according to Church teaching, they are still male or female, whether they believe it or not. For the second point, the Church teaches that our bodies and our sexual identities are not accidents or mistakes. Although the effects of original sin may cause us to suffer and be tempted in the flesh is still ultimately a good thing and must be accepted as God's gift. If a person feels emotional discomfort with their body, the discomfort itself is perhaps another layer of the suffering and temptation that comes from original sin. Even if the discomfort lasts for a long time, or even one's whole life, the discomfort is the aberration that doesn't belong, but the body itself remains a good thing that should be accepted. For the third point, since the body is God's gift, destroying any part of the body is thus destroying God's work. Only in cases of grave necessity, such as when a doctor needs to amputate a limb to stop the spread of gangrene, can it be morally acceptable to cut off a piece of the body. In normal circumstances, we don't have a right to destroy a part of our own or anyone else's body. These are theological and moral teachings of the Church, and according to them, a person needs to accept the sexual identity and the body they received as either male or female. Many people who identify as transgender, non-binary, or other such identities are therefore living at variance with these teachings. God gives us our sexual identities. We don't get to choose this ourselves, nor do we have the power to change what He has given us. We must be thankful to God and faithfully respect His will in the way that He created us. Even if we feel emotional discomfort over something in our nature, we must recognize the truth that God cannot create something unless it is good. On the surface, it would appear that there is no way to reconcile transgenderism with Catholic teaching. The Church teaches, and Pope Francis has emphasized, that we need to embrace sinners into the Church and treat people, including transgender people, with respect and welcome. This approach isn't really reconciling transgenderism itself with Catholic teaching, but in a certain respect, it could be helping with the task of reconciling people who identify as transgender with God. However, in this video, I rather want to ask the question if theologically there is a way to actually reconcile transgenderism with the teaching of the Church. Before I begin, I should first give a warning. Some of these questions I will pose and speculations I'm going to make have dangers in them. Some of these ideas I will present may be heretical. In 2022, Pope Francis spoke to the International Theological Commission, and he distinguished the role of a catechist from a theologian. He said, "Theologians must go further, seek to go beyond." But I want to distinguish this from the catechist. The catechist must give the correct doctrine, the solid doctrine, not possible novelties, some of which are good, but rather what is solid. The catechist transmits the solid doctrine. Theologians dare to go further, and it will be the magisterium that will stop them. But the vocation of the theologian is always to dare to go further, because he or she is searching and trying to make theology more explicit. However, never give a catechesis to children and to people with new doctrines that are not sure. This distinction is not mine. It is St. Ignatius of Loyola's, who I think understood some things better than I do. The purpose of this video is to seek to go beyond and dare to go further. I'm going to push deeply into some topics that, as far as I know, the magisterium has not yet given a clear answer about. However, if, to my ignorance, the magisterium has already answered some of these things, or if it ends up clearly answering these questions in the future, then we must submit to what the magisterium says on the topic. Please do not take the content of this video as reliable catechesis. Listen to your parish priest, your bishop, and the magisterium for guidance on religious and moral questions. Many of the ideas I am about to present may turn out to be wrong or even heretical, but the possibility that they could be true is why we need to explore them more deeply. Now, with the warning given, allow me to start with this question. Where in Catholic doctrine does it actually teach us how to identify whether a person is a man or a woman? This may seem like common sense. The entire world, at least historically, has always assumed on the basis of how the body is arranged determines sexual identity. In the days of ancient Israel, in the days of Christ and the apostles, in most of the church's history, this is not something that would have been in dispute for the vast majority of societies. But common sense doesn't actually establish something as a doctrine. Let me give a historical example. There was once a time when common sense dictated that the sun went around the earth. After all, everyone can see the sun coming up every day in the east, going across the sky, and then disappearing again in the west. For most of the world's history, for most societies and civilizations, this was common sense. You can literally see it go over your head every day of your life. Why would you think it worked in a different way? However, the church never formally defined this to be a doctrine. Why would you need to define what was basic common sense? Galileo, an Italian astronomer of the 17th century, claimed that this wasn't the reality and that actually what appeared to be the sun going across the sky was in reality the Earth spinning on its axis, and the Earth was the one orbiting the sun, not the other way around. The Inquisition persecuted him and ordered him to recant this opinion, believing that what he was saying was contradicting Scripture. The church of that time ended up making a decision in prosecuting his case that would end up humiliating the church. In the 20th century, Pope John Paul II apologized for the treatment of Galileo. Common sense does not create doctrine. Although we might easily assume that a male is this and a female is that, unless the church has formally defined it, how do we really know that we are not actually making the same mistake in our time that the Inquisition made 400 years ago with Galileo? To the best of my knowledge, the church has never formally defined what biological criteria is necessary in order to say that a person is male or female. There is no church document that says if the body has X part or Y feature, then the person is a male or a female. The church has stated that our bodies and our sexual identities are gifts from God that must be accepted. It hasn't stated how a person is actually supposed to determine from their body what sexual identity that they possess. Let me give an example to illustrate. If someone is born female, with an unambiguously biological female body, and she insists that God created her as a male and that her female body is actually male. Her breasts are male breasts. Her vagina and uterus are a male's vagina and uterus. In obedience to church teaching, she then thanks God for creating her as a male and accepts His will in her life. Just as the church teaches that all people must accept the bodies and sexual identities that God has given them. This woman is not rejecting her body. She is fully accepting it. She has not tried to undergo surgery to mutilate herself or change herself in any way. It is just that according to her, all that she possesses is male and not female. Where in the formal doctrines taught by the church, is there a clear statement that would refute this? Do we actually have a document from a council or a pope somewhere that states that if someone has the body part she possesses, then she must be female and not male? Allow me to pose what might seem like a somewhat ridiculous question here. If the magisterium hasn't declared that the sky is blue, are we bound by faith to believe that it is blue? Common sense might require us to believe it is blue. But truthfully, unless the church has formally defined it, a person who denies that the sky is blue is not breaking church teaching by this opinion. There are recent church documents that touch on the transgender issue, without directly touching the question of what body parts make a person male or female. Just last year, the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith published the document Dignitas Infinita, part of which spoke on transgender issues. It condemned gender ideology that sought to eliminate the differences between men and women. It also condemned sex changes. Here is the actual text of the document. Sex change, 60. The dignity of the body cannot be considered inferior to that of the person as such. The Catechism of the Catholic Church expressly invites us to recognize that the human body shares in the dignity of the image of God. Such a truth deserves to be remembered, especially when it comes to sex change, for humans are inseparably composed of both body and soul. In this, the body serves as the living context in which the interiority of the soul unfolds and manifests itself, as it does also through the network of human relationships. Constituting the person's being, the soul and the body both participate in the dignity that characterizes every human. Moreover, the body participates in that dignity as it is endowed with personal meanings, particularly in its sex condition. It is in the body that each person recognizes himself or herself as generated by others, and it is through their bodies that men and women can establish a loving relationship capable of generating other persons. Teaching about the need to respect the natural order of the human person, Pope Francis affirmed that creation is prior to us and must be received as a gift. At the same time, we are called to protect our humanity, and this means, in the first place, accepting it and respecting it as it was created. It follows that any sex change intervention, as a rule, risks threatening the unique dignity the person has received from the moment of conception. This is not to exclude the possibility that a person with genital abnormalities that are already evident at birth or that develop later may choose to receive the assistance of healthcare professionals to resolve these abnormalities. However, in this case, such a medical procedure would not constitute a sex change in the sense intended here. The document states that, moreover, the body participates in that dignity as it is endowed with personal meanings, particularly in its sex condition. The Church teaches that the body has a sex condition, and this sex condition is part of our dignity as human beings. It doesn't answer the question about which specific feature of the body determines the sex condition, however. Returning to the example I gave, suppose the woman who insists that her female body is a male body says that she believes that the two sexes are different and that she supports what the Church says about there being only two genders, so that she rejects gender ideology. Suppose that she says that she believes that the body has a sex condition, but she says that that condition is determined by whether or not you have smooth skin. She says that people who have smooth skin are female and people who have rough skin are male. And according to her, this is the way that the sex condition exists in the body. And she has rough skin, so according to her, the sex condition of her body, given by God, is therefore male. This would seem to be a ridiculous idea, but the question still remains. Can you use church teaching and not just common sense to refute this opinion? Common sense doesn't create church doctrine. Remember the lessons of history. How do we actually know that what determines sex in the body isn't something different than what we normally assume? Returning to my question again. Where in Catholic doctrine does it actually teach us how to identify whether a person is a man or a woman? According to the teaching of the Church, what part of the body, what feature, what thing is there that definitely determines that someone is male or female? I have a possible answer to this question. There is one part of Catholic teaching which I think perhaps indirectly implies something about human biology. The connection is subtle, but I will explain my thinking and why I think the connection is actually necessary and why it is providing an answer to this question about which body part. The teaching I am referring to is the teaching on homosexuality. In the Catechism, it says this: 2358, the number of men and women who have deep-seated homosexual tendencies is not negligible. This inclination, which is objectively disordered, constitutes for most of them a trial. They must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. These persons are called to fulfill God's will in their lives, and if they are Christians, to unite to the sacrifice of the Lord's cross the difficulties they may encounter from their condition. The Catechism doesn't simply say that homosexual acts are disordered. It says that the inclination itself is disordered. What does that then imply for our understanding of the way that God created human beings? The Church teaches that the body and the sexual identity are gifts from God that must be accepted. Everything that God creates is good. We have temptations and suffering in our flesh, not because this is how God made us, but rather that is because original sin has wounded us in such a way that we experience these things. But even though original sin causes our flesh to desire things that are bad, our human nature itself and our bodies are still good things. Original sin didn't cause the flesh to actually become evil, but the more proper understanding is that it wounded the flesh in such a way that something that was good became disposed to easily seeking after evil. If homosexual inclinations are disordered, then I infer that it means that those inclinations can't be part of the way that God created human beings. I infer that it means that every person was created to be heterosexual, and if a person experiences homosexual desires, it is not because they were designed this way, but rather it is because they have been tempted to go against what their nature is designed for. In other words, according to this teaching, there are no men who were designed to be sexually attracted towards other men, nor are there any women who were designed to be sexually attracted towards other women. Indirectly, this is then providing an answer to which part of the body determines sexual identity. The answer is the brain. Biologically speaking, the experience of sexual desires seem to be created by neurons in the brain. According to my inference here from this teaching, it is impossible for God to have created a man who has a brain that is designed to be sexually attracted towards other men, and it is impossible for God to have created a woman who has a brain that is designed to be sexually attracted towards other women. Remember that the church teaches that you must accept your body as a gift from God and accept the way that He arranged it. The brain is part of the body. It must be accepted like every other part of the body. If we said that homosexual desires came from the brain itself, it would then create a contradiction between two different teachings. Because on the one hand, the church teaches that you must accept your body in its integrity, and on the other hand, the church teaches that homosexual inclinations are disordered. If the disorder is coming from the arrangement of the brain itself, then are you not then saying that you need to reject a part of your body? Are you not then saying that there is something in your body that is wrong and needs to change? There are people who are born with disabilities and genetic diseases that give them suffering, but it would still be a mistake to say that the bodies of those people were wrong. I could be wrong, but I've always thought of original sin as causing temptation not because it changed the body to something different from what it was before, but because it denied the body what it needed to be satisfied. Adam and Eve's bodies were exactly the same after they ate the fruit as they were before. What was different was rather that they were deprived in justice from what those bodies needed to be fully satisfied. If you fill your gas tank with water rather than fuel, it won't work, but the problem has nothing to do with the car itself. If you take God's creation of the human body and remove it from paradise, it suffers and experiences temptation, but that is not because the body has a problem. People with disabilities and genetic diseases don't have bodies that are disordered. Rather, they suffer because they live in a fallen world that isn't designed to accommodate them. You can't say that homosexual desires come from the flesh itself on the one hand, and then tell people that they must accept their bodies and how those bodies were arranged on the other hand. Doing so would then break this teaching that says that homosexual inclinations are disordered. If they are disordered, then it means that they are wrong and that they ought to be different. Therefore, why would you accept it and not seek to change it? Therefore, if my reasoning is correct, here is the answer to the question I posed. If someone has a brain that is sexually designed for men, then that person must be a woman, and if someone has a brain that is sexually designed for women, then that person must be a man. It doesn't break church teaching if a woman is born without a uterus or a man is born without a penis. It doesn't break church teaching for hermaphrodites or intersex people to have ambiguous genitalia. It doesn't break church teaching for people to be born with DNA of the opposite sex, as sometimes happens with particular medical syndromes. It does, however, break church teaching if we say that God created someone with a body that was designed to be gay. Now, understanding this, the next inference seems obvious. Since it is impossible for God to have made someone to be gay, then all the people who have same-sex attractions are actually designed to be heterosexual, and the attractions they experience are temptations going against the way that their brains and their flesh are designed, rather than coming from that design. They must have brains that are designed for heterosexual attractions, not homosexual attractions. Perhaps there is some psychological reason why they failed to develop a heterosexual attraction, or there is something else at work here confusing their feelings. But we can't say that the homosexual attraction comes from the arrangement of the brain itself. However, there is a different inference that can be made from this, which is less obvious and perhaps very dangerous. Could we not take this reasoning and also put it in the reverse direction, and it would still work very logically? Rather than saying that because God cannot make anyone gay, therefore gay people must actually be straight, could we not also reverse this and say, if God made someone gay, then that person must actually be a member of the opposite sex? Remember, there is no church doctrine, to the best of my limited knowledge at least, that has ever defined any other feature or part of the body as determining what your sexual identity is. The only body part that I infer church doctrine requiring to be part of every man and woman is that their brains must be designed for heterosexuality. If you had a woman who was sexually attracted towards women, because that is actually the way her brain is designed, then the only conclusion that is left from that is that she is actually a man. And likewise, a man who is sexually attracted towards men because of the way his brain was designed must actually be a woman. You must accept your body as a gift. It is wrong to try to mutilate or reject your body. Your brain is part of your body. Rejecting it is rejecting God's will. It is the same sin as the transgender person who rejects their own flesh and wants to change it into something else. Now, are there women and men who have brains designed like this? That is a question that scientists need to answer. Some scientists have collected some evidence regarding this question too. There is evidence that at least some homosexuals have brains that seem to resemble brains of heterosexual members of the opposite sex. There is some evidence that homosexual desires might be rooted in neurobiology. The evidence is perhaps not conclusive, at least not yet. As a church, we need to avoid potentially making the same mistake that we made with Galileo. If we insist that people can't be born gay and homosexual brains can't exist because of how we understand this doctrine, but it turns out that they do actually exist, we will ultimately then be in the same place as those Inquisition judges telling Galileo that his opinions are heresies. It may be the case that within the group of people who engage in homosexual acts, some of them have brains that are designed for homosexuality, and some of them don't. For the latter group, it would still be correct perhaps to say that their desires are disordered. But for the former group, if my speculations are correct, then their desires are not disordered, but rather these are actually heterosexual attractions, because these people belong to the opposite sex from what common sense dictates. All people are born as either male or female. Just as people once assumed that the sun went around the world because they saw it work like this every day, have we also incorrectly assumed that who is a male and who is a female is based only on outward appearance? Let us suppose now that my hypothesis is correct and that people who are homosexual because of their brain biology are actually heterosexuals of the opposite sex. What would that actually mean? Would it mean, for example, that homosexual acts then became acceptable? The answer would still be no, unless we were referring to something that wasn't sexual. The Catholic Church teaches that sexual acts outside of marriage are always sinful. Furthermore, it also requires that normal intercourse is possible in order for a marriage to be licit. For example, if a man had an injury and he no longer had the parts that allowed him to engage in intercourse, this man would not be permitted to get married to a woman in the Catholic Church. Even though it is heterosexual without question and no other impediments exist, the fact that normal intercourse is impossible means that the marriage cannot be done. This is because marriage is intended for the procreation of children, and intercourse is the only acceptable way within Catholic teaching to have children. Hence, even if my speculations here are correct, and that at least some homosexuals are actually members of the opposite sex, it still wouldn't mean that they could marry someone of the same sex, for the same reason that heterosexual couples couldn't marry when normal intercourse was impossible. And since marriage is necessary in order for any sexual act to be licit, this means that all homosexual acts would still be sinful. If my speculations are correct, however, it would perhaps have a profound effect in the way that many gay people look at themselves as well as the way that others look at them. Rather than telling them that they are disordered, if we instead recognize them and they recognize themselves as being the way that they are because it was God's will, it would perhaps have a profound effect. There are many people in the church who will discriminate or hold prejudices against gay people, even if those people are striving to live according to the commandments. There are countries in the world where a person who claimed to be gay risks many things, including even imprisonment or death, simply for just professing this identity without having done anything else. If the church adopted what I am here speculating about and taught it, it could radically challenge and perhaps change some of the attitudes behind these things. They still couldn't engage in homosexual acts, but we wouldn't look at them, nor would they look at themselves as though there was something wrong with the way that they are. They would ultimately just be people who have a kind of disability that prevents them from having normal intercourse, but the disability itself is something that glorifies God, not an aberration that came from sin. Now, if my speculations are correct about this, there is another huge implication it would have for the church. And this is a very dangerous idea, which we should be very cautious about. The implication is that if some homosexual men are not actually men, it would also follow that if any of these men were ordained to holy orders, then their ordination would not be valid. Furthermore, with the exception of baptism, every sacrament that they gave to others would also be invalid. It would mean that when they did Mass, the bread and wine remained only bread and wine even after they said the words of consecration. When they heard confessions, the sins of the penitents were not absolved. In the case of bishops, it would be even more extreme. Since bishops ordain other men to holy orders, it would mean that if one of these men became bishops, then none of the other men that they ordained actually received ordination as well. And since other bishops they ordained were not actually bishops either, then it would be like a chain reaction in a sense, since when those other men then ordained new bishops, the invalid consecration would keep getting repeated. You could actually end up having huge sections of the church that had invalid sacraments without anyone realizing it. That could be very damaging to the church. People would question the sacraments they received or whether their clergy had a right to lead their communities. Priests and bishops themselves might question their own ordinations. Is it actually possible, however? Even if my speculations in this video about sexual identities are all false, this scenario is still not impossible. It could have already happened without us even realizing it. Firstly, there are two primary requirements for the candidate to ordination in order for the sacrament to be valid. Firstly, the person must be a man. Secondly, the person must be baptized. If the candidate is not a man, then even if she receives ordination, the sacrament is invalid. But likewise, if the candidate is not actually baptized, the ordination is invalid for him too. Invalid baptisms do happen, both in the Catholic Church and in other churches. Sometimes the correct formula for baptism is not followed. A priest in the Diocese of Phoenix in the past few years resigned after it was discovered that he had used the wrong formula for baptisms for 2 decades. In another case, Father Matthew Hood, a priest in Michigan, realized that he needed to be ordained a second time after he saw the video of his baptism when he was a child and realized that the priest had used an invalid formula for baptizing him. Should we assume that Father Matthew Hood was the only case in the Church's history when someone was ordained to the priesthood without being properly baptized? He had the benefit of living in an age when videos exist. What about the rest of the Church's history? Do we really have a way of being certain that every bishop in every country for the past 2,000 years was validly baptized before being validly ordained? We can hold faith that God watches over his church, but I think we might be tempting God if we assume that he would always intervene in every case to make sure that such a thing couldn't occur. But if we don't have certainty about this, then yes, it is theoretically already possible right now that there could be bishops somewhere in the world who are not validly bishops. And it is possible that some dioceses don't have valid clergy or valid sacraments. Even if we can't have absolute certainty about this, we should still probably treat all bishops and other clergy as though they were validly ordained and act accordingly. We should assume that the sacraments we receive are genuine sacraments, even if there isn't an objective way of knowing for certain. In truth, even if the priest was not actually a priest, as long as you were sincerely seeking the grace from the sacrament, God will still find a way to help you and give you what you are seeking. Maybe we can at least assume that every pope was validly ordained if we believe that it is impossible for this institution to ever fail. And if they were validly ordained, then you know at least that every bishop in their episcopal lineage before them must have been validly ordained as well. So, if this is indeed a possible scenario, then the implication that my speculations about sexual identity could be possible too. When Pope Benedict created a rule, which Pope Francis also confirmed, that banned men with deep-seated homosexual tendencies from becoming priests, it had nothing to do with what I've speculated about in this video. It was not because the Church doubted that such ordinations were valid, but rather it was because it was doubted whether these men were appropriate for a vocation to the priesthood. However, if what I've speculated about in this video turns out to be correct, maybe the Church ended up protecting itself from these scenarios occurring. I would even suggest that if there is any reasonable possibility that my speculations here about sexual identity could be true, even without certainty, then that is probably a good reason to keep this rule in place forever. The reason why the clergy must be male is because they are serving in the place of the bridegroom over the church. Thinking about that theological mystery, there seems to be something amiss if the priest or bishop is not actually designed to have a sexuality oriented towards a wife in his neurobiology. There is another important implication that would come out of these speculations. While it would mean that there are perhaps many priests who are not actually priests, it would also mean that there are some women in the world who could receive ordination and the sacrament would be effective for them. If the woman who is designed to have a sexuality oriented towards females is actually a male, then she could theoretically receive ordination to become a deacon, priest, or bishop. Even a female pope would then be possible, since this woman is not actually a woman. For most women, they would still be ineligible because they can't fulfill what the sacrament demands in one who can serve as a husband to the church. But some women could. One minor additional note I can add here. In parts of the Old Testament, wisdom is personified as a woman, going all the way back to the early church fathers. This personification of wisdom in the Old Testament has long been traditionally interpreted as being Christ himself. Here is one of the passages when wisdom herself is speaking. Proverbs 8 verses 22 to 31, "The Lord begot me, the firstborn of his ways, the forerunner of his prodigies of long ago. From of old I was poured forth, at the first before the earth. When there were no depths I was brought forth, when there were no fountains or springs of water. Before the mountains were settled in a place, before the hills I was brought forth. While as yet the earth and the fields were not made, nor the first clods of the world. When he established the heavens I was there, when he marked out the vault over the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when he fixed fast the foundations of the earth, when he set for the sea its limit, so that the waters should not transgress his command. Then was I beside him as his craftsman, and I was his delight day by day, playing before him all the while, playing on the surface of his earth. And I found delight in the sons of men." Christ did not yet have a human nature when the Old Testament was written, and without a human nature, he also had no true sexual identity either. At that time, he was neither really male nor female, although he possessed the destiny to one day become a human male. Hence, even if Christ is personified as a woman in those passages about wisdom, we still know that he wasn't actually female. But think about what this means. The fact that Christ can be represented by a female image in Scripture. If a female image can represent Christ in Scripture, could a person who seemingly has a female body represent Christ at the altar? Could masculine or feminine vocations exist in people who appear to be the opposite sex? Wisdom in the Old Testament is the craftsman who works alongside God in making the creation in all of its glories, secrets, and mysteries. If wisdom herself is in the image of a woman who is later going to be revealed as a man, is that a sign for us that God intended for transgenderism to be part of the mystery of creation? In conclusion, if I summarize what I've presented here, I could say it as follows. 1. The Church, while possessing teaching on sexual identity, has not yet, to my knowledge, given a clear answer to the question of what part of the body actually determines someone's sex. 2. On the basis of its teaching on homosexuality, I reason that church teaching does require that the brain cannot be designed to produce homosexual attraction, which means that this is a part of the body that will in fact determine sex. 3. If existentially it is true that some people have brains that are designed for homosexuality, then the only way to reconcile that with church teaching is if we conclude that those people are actually members of the opposite sex, despite appearances to the contrary. For if the above point is true, it could have huge implications for the church, including especially the clergy, although it wouldn't itself mean that homosexual acts then became acceptable, nor would it mean that mutilation or trying to change one's body became acceptable. I think the weakest point in my speculations is perhaps in point 3, since scientists have not clearly demonstrated, at least to my knowledge, conclusive proof that there are in fact people who have brains like this. We may find out in the end that actually there are no people who have homosexual brains, but even those brains that seem to resemble heterosexual members of the opposite sex are still ultimately designed for heterosexual sexualities. It may also be the case that neural science never advances to the point of unlocking that mystery, especially considering the deep complexities of the brain, and science forever will be unable to give a conclusive answer to this question. Theology is meant to keep pushing deeper until it runs into the hard walls that the magisterium stops it with. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, please do not take anything I have put here as solid teaching, but rather listen to church authorities on this and every question about the teachings of the faith. Trust in God that He will give answers to those who seek Him.